Paint density is the key to getting cells in acrylic paint pouring, whether you use silicone or not. And I'm going to show you why that is the case. And I'm going to give you a resource that you can use to make sure you are using acrylic paint densities the proper way to get cells in your acrylic pours. So let's get to it. All right, first we're going to do a test where I'm going to use 3 different densities of liquids and put them in this bottle here. I'm going to use tap water, I'm going to use oil, and I'm going to use some paint that I have left over from a room that I did. And I want to show you what happens when you use multiple density paints inside of acrylic pour and how the cells form. So first of all, we're going to fill this with water. So mostly water there. Then we're going to use some oil. And notice here, there's actually oil stuck to the bottom there that's just sitting there. And as time passes, the water is going to push against the oil, and the oil is less thick than the water, and it's going to eventually come up, but it's coming up later, as you see with cells in acrylic pours. So the next thing we're going to do is take this paint, going to get a bit of this. If you notice, if I squirt it on top, it can stay on top for a minute. But as soon as it gets any kind of thick section of paint, that paint starts to sink. And it takes some of the light oil down with it. And then the light oil gradually makes its way up, although some of it is still trapped down there. Now, something interesting to note there is some of this blue paint that I'm putting in that's going through the oil, pulling the oil down, going to the bottom, and then the oil is coming back up. The oil is actually pulling some of that blue paint right back up. And essentially, this is what's happening with your acrylic pour. You have, let's say you have 4 different colors of paints, and one of the paints is very heavy, 2 are right in the middle, and the 4th is very light. When you pour the paint onto the canvas, you're going to have layers of those paints. The heavy paint is going to sink. If it's on top, it's going to sink through all 3 of those other paints. The lighter paint is going to rise up through those other paints, and the middle paints are just kind of stay where they are. But as the paint rises up, or as the paint falls down, as we can see here, you're going to get some mixing of those paints, and some of the blue is going to get suspended, or the light paint is going to get suspended in the dark paint, and the dark paint suspended in the light paint, and that's where you get cells happening. So another thing I want to show you is I'm going to put the lid on this. Hopefully I'll put it on tight enough. And then we're just going to flip this over, just like a flip cup would be. And we get some paint mixing. The oil is all coming to the top, and some of this darker paint, you can see it better on this side, is starting to flow through and fall down. And that's what's essentially happening when you do a flip cup, when you pour the paint out. The different densities of paints are moving through each other. Now, this oil is more like silicone, where it's coming up really quickly because it's really, really light compared to the paint. But you could have a light paint, like a lot of reds are very light, and a heavy paint like titanium white or Mars black, or there's a lot of yellows that are actually really heavy that will fall through. And if you can control, or if you can mix your paints of different densities together, you can help this effect happen in your pours. And now let me really blow your mind. I've created a tool that you can use to check the relative density of your acrylic paint. That includes Creative Inspirations, Grumbacher, Artist Loft, Acrylic, Liquitex Basics, Pebeo, Master's Touch, and many more to come. So let me show you that tool and show you how it's really going to help your acrylic pouring. All right, Pouring Nation, the tool I want you to look at is leftbrainedartist.com/acrylic-paint-density-chart. Now, I've put together over 1,500 different paints and their relative density. I say relative because density is based on the pigments that are used and the filler and the acrylic binder that's used in each paint. Most paints use the same type of filler and the same type of acrylic binder, which are very light compared to the pigment. And then they use a section of pigment, and based on the pigment that's in each of these paints and the quality of the paint, I've done a calculation to estimate how dense those paints are. So you can go out and, for example, if I was using Liquitex Soft Body and I use Mars Black and then I use iridescent white and fluorescent red, I would expect the Mars Black to sink and the iridescent white to raise up through the Mars Black, and then the fluorescent red to rise up through the iridescent white and the Mars Black, because it's so much thinner compared to the other two. Now, this is not an exact science. I had to do some calculations to get to this, but at least it gives you an idea of whether that paint is heavy, which is the red, average, which is the yellow, or light, which is the green. And then there's some I did not get the value for, so those show up as 0. And they're white. This also gives you some information about those paints. The product, the color name, its opacity, light fastness, and if you click on the plus, a little bit of information about the pigments, and if I have it, the color index names and the color index numbers. And I hope you can use this to vary the weights of paint that you use in your acrylic pours to help you better get cells. For something like the Sheleeart blooms, I would come in here, I would sort by density downward, and I have to get my pagination. So we're going to go right to the very end. And look, I have my heaviest paints here, and maybe I don't have any of these, but I have this Liquitex Soft Body Transparent Mixing White. I could potentially use that along with a second cell activator of, orange, and that would give me a nice cell activator for my Sheleeart blooms. Or if I'm just doing a flip cup and I want to use Venetian red and then a couple of different colors, I want to make sure my Venetian red is on the bottom, which turns into the top when I do the flip cup, to make sure that it moves through the other paint and I get that cell creation and I get those colors mixing a little bit. So again, this is leftbrainedartist.com/acrylic-paint-density-chart. If you have additional paint brands that you'd like me to put on this, you can use my Contact Us form or just leave a comment below. I will say, because craft paints do not provide the pigments that they have, I will not be able to do this for craft paints. Also, craft paints are almost exclusively light. Very few craft paints use high quality pigments, and therefore you don't get good pigment density from the craft paints. So just keep that in mind when you're doing this. Now, another problem that artists have when they're trying to create cells is they don't get the right consistency. Now, this is the video I'd recommend you watch next to get the perfect consistency for your acrylic pour.